Good morning, everyone. Good morning, those of you who are joining us on the webcast. Welcome. It is Monday morning and a DTSC public meeting. This is the second one we've done, this general public meeting. So the first what I'd like to do is introduce who I have up here with me on the dais, and then go through some logistics, and then talk a little bit about the agenda. So on my right, your left, is my Chief Deputy, Miriam Ingenito. And here I have my deputy for the cleanup program, Mr. Stuart Black. Next to him is our deputy for the Safer Workplaces and Products program, Dr. Meredith Williams. Next to her is our deputy for our legislative program, legislative issues. That's Josh Tooker. And next to him is our deputy for the hazardous waste management program, Mr. Brian Johnson. So in the room we have some other deputies and esteemed colleagues, and perhaps watching we have our fellow staff here at DTSC who do the work along with us. What we're going to do today is I'm going to set the context for the meeting. I'm going to give some opening remarks about what has happened at DTSC between now and the previous public meeting, which was back in early or mid-December. And then we will get into our two presentations for the day. We will have 3 opportunities for public comment. One will be a general public comment for things not on the agenda, which will occur right after my remarks. And then we will have a public comment period between or after each presentation. And I'll talk a little bit more about that when we get closer to the public comment periods. So why do we have these meetings? The DTSC does a number of public meetings, a number of meetings with communities around specific sites and specific issues. But as you know, DTSC is not a board, it's not a commission, and so there is no requirement to have an overarching regular set of public meetings. And yet we understand that, like boards and commissions, our department makes decisions that impact many in California. And that trust in our decisions can erode if people don't understand what we're thinking, what went behind the decisions, what were the factors we considered, and how did we come across the choices that we made? How did we arrive at those decisions? And so as a vehicle for that kind of transparency and sharing our thought processes, we decided to institute regular public meetings. These are quarterly meetings. This is our second one. And at the end of the meeting, I'll talk about when our next one is. And this is basically, we're here today because I myself and the staff who are up with me, my deputies and those of you in the room, we are all committed to transparency. And this is just one example of that commitment. So the 2 presentations we're going to have, one is going to be an update on Exide, the battery recycler in Vernon. We'll also do an update on the priority products announcement that we made last Thursday. And as I said, there'll be 3 times for public comment, one after my remarks and one after each of the presentations. There are different ways we're going to receive those public comments. One is you can fill out a card, and the cards are, I don't know where they are outside the door. So if you would like to make a comment or ask a question, you can get a card and turn it in. And I will go through the cards and invite you up to the microphone. Or if you're listening in on the web, you can send an email and a comment or question. And that's at DTSC public meeting, all one word, at dtsc.ca.gov. So that would be DTSC public meeting, all one word, at dtsc.ca.gov. We will put that up behind me so that you will know that email address if you can't write it. There it is right now. Perfect. So the web, anybody on the web who would like to put in a comment, we will collect them here and I will be notified and read them as you write them. My request on the public comment on the questions is that you direct the questions to me, that the comments, the questions should be directed to me as the director, and then I will ask my colleagues to answer them as need be. Or it could be that there is no answer in this moment, that it's simply noted for future reference, and we will either get back to you as individuals, or on our website we will post something, or perhaps if it's more in-depth, we will take that under consideration, that issue, and perhaps agendize it for our next public meeting. So, since the last public meeting, back in mid-December, a lot has happened for our department. We have greatly strengthened the support that we've received from the governor's office and from the legislature. We've achieved significant milestones that demonstrate our resolve in enforcement, that demonstrate our commitment to innovation and to launching new initiatives. And we're sending strong signals about the path that DTSC is on, both here in California and across the globe. So if I go back sort of chronologically, on January 9th, the governor released his budget. And in that budget, it was recognized that DTSC has significant needs for additional resources. And those resources are focused on addressing key foundational issues. We have a phrase here at DTSC, we talk a lot about it, we refer to it almost daily, and that is that we are fixing our foundation. And in fact, these budget change proposals, we affectionately call them BCPs. The BCPs all address various elements of our Fixing the Foundation initiative. Specifically, we are asking the legislature to grant us resources to work in 4 general areas. We need and want to enhance our cost recovery program. So these are the money that is owed to the state because we have put out public funds to clean up contaminated sites, and we either have not billed yet or are in challenging situations with responsible parties to try and get that money back. We also need to pay very close attention to our hazardous waste tracking system. This is the electronic system that tells us where hazardous waste is going from cradle to grave, and that system is antiquated. It's operating with Band-Aids, holding it together, if you will, and we need the resources to recode and repair the system. We also need resources to prioritize and recraft reports so we can get useful information out of it and review the manifests and correct the errors in the manifests. And the manifests, of course, are the functional start to this system, because that is the information filled out by the generator and the transporter that tells us what is being moved across the state of California and out of the state of California in terms of hazardous waste. And finally, in terms of our permitting program, we have asked for additional resources to help with our backlog and to help ensure that the financial assurance, which is the mechanism we use to make sure that permitted facilities have money available should they need to close or should there be cleanup at their sites that needs after they have ceased operations. So those mechanisms need to be brought up to date. And we need help with our backlog because we have facilities that are operating under extended permits, too many of them, and we want to do a better job at that. So that's the budget. These new positions, there are 25 positions roughly, $4.5 million that we've asked for. They're all limited term, meaning they're 2-year positions that come from reserves in our budget. It's not new fees or new revenue to the state. And we're asking for this money to fix our foundation, to strengthen the programs we have, and it will fix us on the short term to give us an ability to move forward. It's not a long-term fix for the department. To me, as the director, the fact that the governor put this in his budget and the fact that the legislature so far seems very interested in supporting us is a very important indication of the kind of support that this department is receiving at this date and time. So the other thing that happened that was very significant since the last meeting occurred on January 15th. On January 15th, the Senate Environmental Quality Committee scheduled an oversight hearing on our department. They specifically wanted to know about our hazardous waste management program. They wanted to know about our permitting efforts, and they also wanted to know specifically about the metal recycling initiative and metal shredding operations. It was a very intense 3 hours long. We were well prepared. We heard a lot from the various senators. The senators that came were not only from the committee, but also other senators that had a real interest in hearing about what was going on in our department and had serious concerns about our ability to fulfill our mission, particularly in light of the news articles that had surfaced in the LA Times, some reports that had been done about our department. There was a grave level of concern that DTSC was not able to function professionally and with accountability. There were pointed questions. There was a lot of discussion back and forth, some key observations. The senators did not hold back in terms of their concern about our department, sharing their perspectives. But I can say by the end of that 3-hour period, it was clear to me, and it was clear to everyone in the room, that the Senate believed that we had a credible path forward, that they trusted that we understood the scope and nature of the challenge ahead of us, and that they were there to help. They wanted to know what could they do to help DTSC succeed. So I believe that between January 9th and January 15th, DTSC has turned a corner, a very significant corner, as we have worked so hard as a department throughout the state, every one of our regional offices, every one of our staff, asking themselves the question, how can I fix our foundation? How can I make sure that the work we do builds confidence in the people we regulate, builds confidence in the communities we protect, and builds confidence in the businesses who are going to come under our Safer Consumer Product program? There's still clearly much more work that needs to be done. But I think the frankness in that hearing was indicative of the fact that we are not afraid of owning our warts, owning our challenges, and that we know what good work looks like. We know what it means to be professional. And I want to share with you some of the examples of that professionalism, that great pride that have also happened in this department in the last 3 months. So one of them is what I like to call DTSC as the hub of the wheel. And again, those of my colleagues who are listening to this also know that phrase because we use it a lot at DTSC. And what that means is that people around the state, whether they are businesses or communities, look at government often as a morass. So many different agencies with complicated, perhaps overlapping authorities. And it's a nightmare for people to understand, well, whose job is it to take care of what problem? It's difficult to understand, let alone navigate, if you want to have something change in your community or get a response in your business. And at DTSC, we often find that community members and businesses and school districts will come to us because we're out there in the community with our public participation, with our cleanup program, with our permitting program, and they'll ask us for help on things that really aren't our job. And we don't want to say, not our job. We don't want to say, not our jurisdiction. So we have owned the task of being that hub of the wheel, of being a convener, bringing in the other state, federal, local agencies to help people get the job done, whatever that job is, to help people sort through that morass. So a couple examples in the last 3 months of that hub of the wheel commitment that we have at DTSC. One is the creation of the California Clean Green Healthy Schools Partnership in LA. That's a collaboration we're doing with US EPA. where we're working with the school districts, and there are many of them in Southern California, so it's not just LA Unified, to try and help identify what are the environmental concerns for the various schools and who needs to be at the table to solve them. So we launched that initiative. We had over 50 people in the room at our first meeting, and each subsequent meeting is going to focus on a different environmental issue for a different school district to try and help move them forward. Secondly, there's something called IVAN. This is something I find tremendously exciting. Well, the acronym doesn't necessarily tell you what it does, but I'll tell you the acronym stands for Innovation, Value, Access, Networking. The bottom line of what is an IVAN is that it's an environmental monitoring system that gives voice and power to local communities. I like to think of it as an environmental neighborhood watch program. So the idea is community members can be the eyes and ears on the ground. They can send in electronically or through phone, or now there's even an app that's been developed for that, if they see something that concerns them. If it's illegal dumping, if it's an odor, if it's some sort of air emission, if it looks like it's a discharge to the sewer or to the storm drain. There's a one-stop shop where those communities can feed in that information. And what makes this powerful is that we don't stop there. That what we have done at DTSC is we've assigned a DTSC staff person in some of these IVANs to be what's called a problem solver. The person who looks at all that information is the hub of the wheel and then gets it out to the right agency. And again, we don't stop there. So once it's out to the agency, then the community member wants to know, well, did anything happen with my complaint? And so there's a feedback mechanism to let those community members know what is going on based on their complaint. There are now 5 of these IVANs, if you will. The first one of them was in the Imperial Valley, and so the original IVAN acronym, the IV, stood for Imperial Valley. But we've changed it because so many communities, environmental justice communities, has seen this as an important tool. So the Imperial Valley was the start. We launched one in the Coachella Valley, in Fresno County, in Kern County, and our latest one was in Wilmington. All these are communities that are superbly burdened by industry, by other environmental impacts, and they don't feel like they have a voice. So this is a way to focus our attention on those environmental justice communities, on those impacted communities, to make sure they get the response that they deserve. So under the leadership of Jesse Marquez in the city of Wilmington, we launched the LA Scene, LACEEN, which is their own environmental network. And now the residents of Wilmington will join the other 4 communities in having their own environmental neighborhood watch program. Perhaps, though, the largest or the most visible aspect or measure of DTSC's resolve is in our enforcement program. Because at the end of the day, it's not those businesses that are in compliance or those businesses that are happy to clean up the messes that they have made that are the real challenge for California. The real challenge are the businesses and the individuals who don't want to pay attention to the laws. And it makes no sense to have the most strict environmental laws in the country if we don't enforce them. And so I want to talk about a few things that have happened recently in the enforcement program that I think demonstrate the seriousness of our resolve and our commitment to enforce the law. The first was something we just announced last week, was a company called Electroforming in the city of Richmond. This was a joint effort between our cleanup program, our legal office, emergency response, and the leadership of the Office of Criminal Investigation. The reckless behavior by the owner of Electroforming needed to stop. This is an individual who had a similar operation in Hayward and operations in other states as well. They posed a serious risk to the neighborhood. It was a plating operation, and they were storing all sorts of materials in illegal containers, in illegal manners, and it was a danger to the surrounding neighborhood. Our Office of Criminal Investigation started by ordering a removal to make the area safe for the surrounding community. And then we joined forces with the local district attorney, and criminal charges were filed last week, 11 felony counts and 12 misdemeanors. The owner of Electroforming turned herself in, and we expect that justice will be served. In Santa Fe Springs, a former transporter decided to abandon waste in 3 different locations. He had taken waste that he had transported, collected from across the state, stored it illegally in 3 areas around LA, and caused the property owners around there to have to clean up his mess. In January, he was sentenced after being found guilty on 6 felony violations of hazardous waste laws. The judge gave jail time and probation, and our costs are going to be recouped. Another transporter in the Central Valley was just fined to almost $250,000 and banned from ever transporting hazardous waste. We found out about this one when the San Joaquin Environmental Health Organization notified DTSC that there was a trailer at a truck stop that had been parked there for years, it turned out. And when we went in to see what was in there, there were tons, thousands of pounds of hazardous waste. Our emergency response coordinated the cleanup, which took 5 days. And now that the charges have been brought and the fines have been levied, we will again recoup our costs. In Long Beach, we were contacted by the local CUPA, the Long Beach CUPA, the local enforcement agency, to come and help, because in the backyard, it was discovered in the backyard next to an elementary school, somebody had stored 10,000 pounds of hazardous waste. So our emergency response went in, they made sure it was cleaned up, and now we are working with a local CUPA to recoup our expenses. So between Ivan, between Electroforming, between these transporters, the picture I want to paint for you is that DTSC uses the full capability of its enforcement and does so in partnership with the locals, whether it's a district attorney, a CUPA, a school district, or other state agencies and federal agencies like EPA. We work in partnership to protect the state of California. So we've made tremendous progress, and we know there's more to do. We're very proud of our accomplishments, and today you're going to hear more about what is going on that is significant at DTSC. So now I would like to turn it over to the public comment. This is general public comment on things not on the agenda. So I ask if anybody has the public comment to hold it if they want to talk about Exide or want to talk about the safer consumer products. Again, you can raise questions, you can make a comment. We may not be able to address them here, but it'll certainly be noted for future either interaction with you or getting back to you at our next meeting. So with that, are there any cards for general public comment? None in the room. Are there any emails asking for general public comment? Okay, we're going to be very efficient here. So with that, we will move on to the first presentation today, which is, I would like to introduce Brian Johnson. He's going to provide an update of the most recent developments on Exide in Vernon. Before he starts, I want to take a minute to talk about why this was on the agenda. The timing of this information is critical. This is new breaking information, if you will. And therefore, it exemplifies the fact that we will use these public meetings to share with you the most relevant information, the most timely information that we have. And in fact, we shifted the agenda around when this Exide news was breaking because we realized this was a wonderful opportunity for us to share with people interested in what was going on at this facility in a timely manner. As most of you know, Exide is one of our most challenging projects, and for good reason. It's operated, this facility, which recycles lead acid batteries, that's a good thing. We want those lead acid batteries to be recycled. However, it is operated for years in what we call an interim status, for decades, in fact, without an up-to-date permit. And it's operated in near neighborhoods with modest homes that are subjected to numerous environmental impacts. This facility has had numerous violations, both from our agency, from DTSC, and from the Regional Air Quality Management District. And yet, it is still operating. It continues to be under intense scrutiny, not only by us and by AQMD, but also by the local county officials, the local churches, and community groups. And all that scrutiny has taken us down a very interesting and often challenging path. We are making tremendous progress with the company, insisting that they make changes, insisting that they protect the community that they impact. We have some of our best staff, our finest staff, working on this facility, and I'm very proud of the progress that has been made by DTSC over the last months. So this past week, we took a significant step to ensure that the public's health was protected, and I've asked Brian to discuss these latest developments with all of you, as well as our next steps. Thank you, Brian.
Good morning, Director Rafael and colleagues. I will be taking over the media portion, which is always a dangerous thing, but so I'll take over from here. I want to thank you for this opportunity to update you and our colleagues, and I also want to thank you on behalf of our staff, many of whom are in the room, for this opportunity to talk to you and let the public know what has been happening at this site. Specifically, as you mentioned recently, it has been, at least in this, we call it our recent history with Exide, about a year-long period that we have been engaged at an extraordinary level with this facility. So in recognition of the recentness of the work that has been done and the tremendous interest that has been shown by the community, by local and state legislators, and by the media, we're going to focus initially in this presentation on that most recent set of activities, and then we will use the latter half of the presentation. We'll talk a little bit about the context of this work that has just happened and paint a bit of a broader brush to get an understanding of what is happening also at the facility. So as you mentioned, this is a lead-acid battery recycler. They get batteries from off-site. They come in trucks, pallet loads of lead-acid batteries that all of us have in the cars that we sometimes drive. This is a facility that crushes those batteries. They then have 3 material streams that come out of that crushing process. One is sulfuric acid, which they treat on-site and dispose to the sanitary sewer under stringent requirements. The second waste stream are the plastic chips that are the outer covering, the case of those batteries. Those are washed off and they are sent to another hazardous waste facility up in Bakersfield for recycling into other plastic products. I believe many of them actually are recycled into new battery cases. And the last waste stream is the lead, and that is what brings us here today. The lead is smelted in furnaces. They have furnaces on site that melt that lead from the batteries and then form them into ingots, and they're sent off to other markets and industries for use in those industries. The facility, as you see behind us, is located in Vernon. It's been at this facility, at this site for about, oh gosh, almost 90 years. It apparently started there back in the 1920s as a lead smelter. This map depicts several things that I want to call your attention to. As you see right in the center of the map is the facility itself, Exide. Today's initial presentation is going to focus on those, and I'm going to call them tan boxes that you see on the edges of that ring, that black ring. Those tan boxes represent 2 neighborhoods, residential neighborhoods that we're going to talk about. I also want to call your attention to the green dots, which are actually schools that we will also talk about in this presentation and what we've learned about lead impacts at those schools. For orientation purposes, being a former Angelino, probably the most familiar landmarks are those freeways. Exide is nestled there between the south of the 5 freeway, about a mile from the 5 freeway, about a mile west of the 710 freeway in an industrial area of East Los Angeles that very generous blue line you see is the Los Angeles River, obviously drawn before the drought conditions with more water than is in it. But their location adjacent to that river is an important factor when we think about what the potential environmental impacts of this facility and their emissions may be. That black line that you see is a distance line of 4,500 feet, just under a mile from the facility, drawn around that. And that gives you a sense of how far the neighborhoods are that we're looking at, and the extent to which the impacts from the emissions from Exide that we are attempting to characterize now. So this is an industrial area, as I said. Just north of Exide, you see there is a very large intermodal train transport and exchange. The freeways, this is the industrial part of Los Angeles. So, DTSC ordered Exide several months ago to evaluate the extent to which any of their activities, their operations, may have impacted these nearby neighborhoods. The neighborhoods that we were looking at, they're large, several hundred homes in each of these neighborhoods. They are the residential areas closest to Exide. And it was a first step evaluation. We were looking to cover a broad territory with sampling. And when you do that, you get general information about a large area, and sometimes you don't get the detailed information that you may need further down the line. And that's important because we need to think of this as an initial step to get a screening level understanding of what's happening in those neighborhoods. You see one is to the north, one is to the south. These neighborhoods were chosen, one based on proximity and two based upon prevailing wind patterns, and that they are likely to be the most likely locations of potential impacts from emissions from Exide. We also, and you can't see on the map that I showed you, a background area to help us understand what the ambient conditions are. In urban areas, there are often ambient levels of contaminants that are just part and parcel of human activity, some of it naturally occurring. Lead itself is an element, so you will actually see that in soil because it is a basic element, but you will see ambient concentrations. The background area that we chose was actually, it was 14 miles south of Exide, and it was located down there because we were looking for a residential area that had a similar age housing stock, similar proximity to other potential sources, but was outside of the potential influence of Exide's emissions, so not influenced by what Exide was doing. So we took a tremendous number of samples from these homes. We took 5 samples from every home. We sampled 39 homes. There were 19 in the north and 20 in the south neighborhoods, 39 in total. At each of the homes, we took 5 sample locations, and at each of those 5 sample locations, we took 3 samples at the surface of the soil, 1 to 3 inches below the soil, and then at 6 inches below the soil. So we took a good number of samples at these 39 homes. We tested them for metals, including lead, arsenic, chromium, cadmium, antimony. We also tested for some hydrocarbons, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, as well as dioxins and furans. So what did we find? As we know, we need to interpret the data. Data doesn't speak to us. We actually have to interpret data. What we found was arsenic below background levels, and that was the good news. All the constituents that we found except lead were below background and screening levels, and that was good news. The screening level for residents for arsenic is 12 parts per million, and we were typically in about the 3 or 4 or 5 part per million range for the residences that were tested. I'm very happy to report that piece of the news. On the troubling side, about 95% of the samples that were tested 95% came in with concentrations, tested for concentrations higher than the screening limit. Now, the screening limit is an important number because it forms a baseline or a reference point for how we evaluate the potential risk associated with concentrations of contaminants in a residential area. We have chosen a screening limit of 80 parts per million for lead in soil. And this is based upon considerable counsel and advisement with our partner agencies, particularly with the Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessment and with the Los Angeles County Department of Health, their lead experts, with US EPA, their lead experts, and with the State Department of Public Health. We all decided together under their counsel that 80 parts per million would be the most protective standard from which DTSC, which we used as a baseline to determine how severe lead contamination may be. Now we also, as you remember back to the map, we tested 2 schools, one to the north and one to the south. The school to the south was San Antonio Elementary School, and fortunately we did not find any concentrations in excess of screening limits at that school. We did not find any. The school to the north, Salazar Head Start, we did find one of the samples about 3 inches below surface, tested slightly above the screening limit. And they have been notified, and we've been in ongoing dialogue with them. So, what these numbers mean. Based upon this, our conferring with our partner agencies who have very specific expertise in lead prevention, we understand that these numbers do not represent an emergency condition that would require DTSC or any other intervention agency to be out there tomorrow to clean soil up or to create some sort of measure that reduced exposures. But we are concerned. Anytime we find concentrations of any contaminants in excess of screening limits, that's important to us. Our job is protecting public health. And when we find these numbers, we understand and will compel that additional steps be taken. And that's where we find ourselves now. So I just want to again acknowledge that our own Office of HERO, we call them, Human and Ecological Risk Office, have been instrumental in assisting us to interpret this data. They have worked very closely with our partner agencies, including the ones that I've just mentioned, EPA, the California Department of Public Health, LA County, OEHA, and we have all concurred that the 80 part per million standard is an important standard for us to adhere to. There are other standards that have been used historically with other environmental agencies. For instance, US EPA has used a guideline of 400 parts per million as their standard for taking additional action. We felt that this more recent science that identified 80 parts per million as being the most protective of those residents who are most vulnerable to potential lead poisoning, which are pregnant women and young children, that 80 parts per million is going to offer a level of protection to those most vulnerable, and therefore that's the level that we're using for our screening level and our action level. So Exide submitted a report. They gave us all of this information, and we last week sent a letter back to Exide, and this letter directed Exide to do several things. They need to submit a work plan to us. The first thing right off the bat, what measures they plan to use to minimize any potential health threats in these areas just tested, with a focus on pregnant women and children. We also directed them to undertake more detailed sampling. We directed them in these same neighborhoods that we have seen to do more refined, specific, and detailed sampling on a house-by-house basis out in their yards to help us understand in a more refined way what additional steps for mitigation or interim measures, something that can happen in the short term that helps to minimize exposures, to what they plan to do to achieve that. We have also directed them to step out from those neighborhoods that have been tested already, and to test neighborhoods in a broad swath out and around these neighborhoods, likely triple or quadrupling the area that has been tested around each of them already. So they're going to be doing additional sampling out in more neighborhoods, as well as more refined sampling in the neighborhoods that we've already tested. All of this work is due in a work plan to DTSC this Friday, March 21st. We gave them a very short deadline because we want to make sure that any interim measures that are necessary to protect, particularly those most vulnerable, are in place as soon as possible. It's not an emergency, but there's no reason that we can't direct them to move as swiftly as possible. It's very important to DTSC to let the community know what's happened. What do we know now? What can we share with you? How can we help you understand this information that we've gotten in? We're a science-based organization. We get scientific data in. For some in the community, they need assistance understanding, well, what does that mean? Is this a problem or is this fine? So we undertook a very robust communications effort at actually 3 levels to make sure that our message, that the information that we had gleaned got out to all of the folks who may be affected by the information that we have received from Exide. So we actually, last week, we undertook personal phone calls, individual phone calls to all of the homeowners of those 39 homes and had conversations with most of them. Some we could not catch, but had conversations. This is largely a bilingual region, so much of all of this was done in English and Spanish. We called them, we followed that up simultaneously with a mailing so that they had a document package that actually gave them the individual results for their home, as well as additional information about what the results showed and some recommendations that we made to help them take some steps to protect their own family's health in the interim, and we'll touch on that in a bit. So we called all 39 homeowners in those neighborhoods inside the squares in the northern and the southern assessment areas. We sent out a notice in the mail to all of them, to all of the residents there, to help them understand, not with specific house-by-house data, but in general, what has happened in their neighborhood. And then there is a broader mailing list of the broader community around them that also received a mailing that let them know what happened. Also, we touch bases with, we touch bases with community leaders with individual phone calls as well last week so that they had an understanding of what had happened and what DTSC's response has been. So, tremendous amount of community outreach, very good response from the community, concerns expressed, questions have been posed, and we are in the process. We have now, not in the process, but we have a single point of contact. One of our staff members down in Southern California, where there's one point of contact for residents to call into if they have questions. And that has been posted, that phone number and that email is posted on all of the outreach information. Lastly, it won't be lastly, but at this point, we have also 2 public workshops that are taking place tomorrow night at the LA Resurrection Church, one tomorrow night, one on Wednesday night. And we have invited the entirety of the communities in to, in a workshop setting, have a dialogue, have a conversation where we can talk to them about what we've learned. We can talk to them about what else, what concerns they may have, and what the next steps are. I understand also we are planning to have a 3rd workshop, likely to happen within the next 2 weeks, in a community south of Exide in Maywood. so that we have a little broader coverage and make it more convenient for the residents to engage with DTSC. All of the documentation that I just talked about, the report from Exide, DTSC's response to that report from Exide, all of the flyers, all the frequently asked questions, all that information is up on our website, so it's accessible electronically. We also have distributed copies of that to interested folks in the community, and we will certainly, of course, have all this information with us when we meet with the workshops. So I mentioned these protective steps. What are as a part of our communication to these residents, what did we tell them? We told them what we found. We helped them understand the significance of what we found. And we also wanted to help give them some useful information, some basic steps that they can take to protect themselves and their family's health in this interim period while additional data is being collected and any necessary interim measures are being planned. So all of these recommendations came based upon our conversations with lead experts throughout California, and they're pretty basic hygiene issues for the most part. You know, if there is bare dirt in your yard, don't discourage your children from playing in it. Wash your hands. Make sure your kids wash their hands, particularly the youngest ones who have more hand-to-mouth activity. Wash their hands more often. If you have a garden, just make sure that you wash your homegrown fruits and veggies real well before you eat them. And to minimize tracking in of any soil or dust inside of your home, put doormats at the doors. Additionally, we are encouraging the residents to participate in the blood testing that has been funded by Exide based upon our stipulation and our order to Exide. We are encouraging the residents to participate in that blood testing. And the blood testing should start, we believe, next month. It will be offered as it stands now in several fixed locations, and we're hoping they have a van that runs through town to make it more convenient for those folks who would like to get their blood tested. Blood testing is a first step, and I do not anticipate it will be the last step in helping us understand what body burdens may exist in the community based upon lead exposures that are occurring. So we have understood through extensive dialogue. I've been participating in phone calls some time now. Over the past week, I've talked to probably 6 or 8 different lead experts and public health experts throughout this nation and actually Canada as well about the value and the limits of different ways of testing individuals, humans, for any body burden for these kinds of toxic metals. And what we've learned is that the blood testing, while it's helpful in understanding if there is an immediate acute need for any kind of therapy to reduce metals levels in individuals, it has a lot of limits. And one of the most significant limit is that it reflects only short-term exposures, most recent short-term exposures. And we know these communities, they're pretty stable communities. Folks have lived there a long time. There are second, third, fourth generation residents that I've spoken to. So if there are chronic exposures, they have a lot of interest in understanding, do I have something else to worry about? Could there be additional exposure to lead in myself or my children? So we are talking to these additional experts and likely coming up with a path forward for some form of additional body burden testing that we have not yet concluded, but that's in the works right now, and I think it's important that we understand that. Okay, so again, all of this should be coming in on Friday. We directed Exide to submit this information on Friday. We have an expedited review, probably take us into next week to review what they have given us, whether we think the plans that they've submitted are sufficiently health protected of the community, if it sufficiently covers the kind of sampling that we think that we need to better understand what the next steps should be. So that is all underway, will be underway beginning next week with our review. A lot of the community has asked us, well, when are you going to be out fixing this problem? When will you be in my yard doing something to get rid of this lead? So timing is very, very important. We have concluded with confidence this is not an emergency situation, but we want to move swiftly. Part of that timeline, it's important to know, for that state law requires for interim measures in a cleanup process like this, that the interim measures are subject to CEQA and a public comment period. So there's a 30-day public comment once the plan is concluded, and then a CEQA determination is made, and we respond to comments, and then we will be out in the field. So we had hoped that perhaps this would be a week or two away, but we have to adhere to the state law to make sure that we allow the community this formal opportunity to respond and make that CEQA determination. So that's where we are in this most immediate action. I want to step back now and talk just briefly about the context of this and how we got here. Okay, as you recall, March of last year, DTSC received two pieces of information that were quite startling to us and caused great concern. Two pieces of information. One was a risk assessment that Exide did that was submitted to AQMD that revealed what we considered unacceptable levels of cancer risk. The second was a piece of information that revealed that they had degraded subsurface pipes that were carrying stormwater and exterior wash water that we felt were a source of continuous release to the environment. So in April, a month later, we issued the temporary suspension order. We shut the facility down. Following on to that, there's an administrative hearing process that Exide and DTSC entered into for Exide to respond to that suspension. There was a concurrent set of Superior Court actions that they undertook. In the Superior Court, as you recall, the judge allowed them to reopen based upon a preliminary injunction. And during that whole period, we were talking with Exide and making it clear to them what we needed from DTSC to ensure that public health is protected and that they take the necessary steps to repair that facility, to invest in that facility, in order for us to feel confident that we could lift the suspension order formally. And that set of actions was, as you know, was formalized in the stipulation and order, an enforcement order that was issued from DTSC. And there were four sort of buckets of things that were required in that enforcement order. First, they needed to remove and replace the old piping, get it out of there, and put in new piping that was compliant with all the hazardous waste control laws. We had them on an expedited schedule to install additional air pollution control devices. We also required them to fund the blood lead level testing, which is about to be underway. And then lastly, this offsite dust and soil sampling that we've just talked about. So what have we done? What progress has been made at the site for those four areas? Okay, we just talked about the progress of the offsite dust or soil sampling, but what else has happened? It's important to know that there has been progress. The new piping is about 90% completed. The last pieces of that have been delayed based upon some right-of-way access that they had to negotiate and have now successfully, that is underway to complete it 100%. They have also been out sweeping and actually vacuuming an area about 200,000 square feet around their facility. The hardscape surfaces, the streets, the sidewalks, with specialized vacuums that pick up any contaminants that may have been emitted and fallen out from their facility. We also learned that there were elevated levels in sedimentation and the urban debris that collects in storm drain basins. There were elevated levels of lead, and we had them clean those out immediately. And of course, this community sampling that we've just talked about, that is underway. All of this is happening in the context of a permit review. They have submitted their application to get a permit from DTSC. All of these actions are a part of our consideration of whether Exide is a facility that can, in a sustained way, remain in compliance and be safe and not pose a risk to the community. So all of these actions, their willingness to cooperate, their enforcement record, their willingness to invest in this facility, all of that is a piece of that permit, a part of that permit consideration. And frankly, the jury is still out. We do not yet know whether this is a facility that will or will not get a permit. We're not doing this alone. There are other facilities, as you mentioned early on, that have been very engaged with Exide. AQMD is probably the most directly engaged. They themselves filed a petition to abate, which is essentially their temporary suspension order, and Exide is defending against that, and they're in an administrative process at AQMD to internally. It's an internal administrative process. Probably will take a few more months, I believe, before that concludes and they have an outcome as to whether or not this facility will be shut down by AQMD until such time as they can install the necessary pollution control equipment, or will they be allowed to operate while they are installing that equipment. Exide also filed a complaint in Superior Court for violations of AQMD rules with a possible penalty assessment up to $40 million. That is in play also right now. And lastly, AQMD, they adopted a new rule that is very specific to lead smelters. It's Rule 1420.1. And it requires a very quick turnaround from any lead smelter, and there's only two in California, Exide, and another facility, Quimetco in City of Industry, requires them to very quickly install additional pollution control equipment. And Exide has turned around and sued the AQMD over this rule in a countersuit to, I'm not certain, other than delaying, I believe their intent is to delay the implementation schedule of that rule. So in closing, I think you will see these activities that I've laid out on behalf of our staff, the many staff that have been working on this, underscore DTSC's commitment to this community. And this is a community around Exide, these cities of Maywood, of Bell, of Commerce, of Boyle Heights, that have experienced extraordinary burdens, environmental burdens. They live in an area with a lot of industrial activity around them. They live near freeways. They live in an area that deserves extraordinary attention from regulatory agencies, and that is what we have been lending. We are continuing to hold Exide's feet to the fire to make sure that they are held accountable for any impacts that they have had in the communities around them, and that they take responsibility for correcting any of those impacts. We're keeping the communities informed. We'll continue to talk to them. We'll continue to meet with them. We'll continue to listen to them about their concerns and what DTSC can do to help them understand and manage as we move forward with Exide. We're continuing to work with the residents and the schools in particular. We have reached out to each of the schools to help them understand what we have found. We will continue to work with them and Los Angeles County Health as we move forward in characterizing the areas around those schools. And as I say, along with LA County Health, with the other agencies that are involved, we'll continue to coordinate with them and make sure that the decisions that DTSC makes are well vetted, although based on our authority, taking advantage of the full science and expertise of those who deal with the lead issues on a daily basis so that we can be assured that the steps that we take are protective of public health in these communities. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Brian. I thank you for that presentation. Before we go to questions from the dais first, I just want to announce that we do have a Spanish translator here. So if there is anyone who wants to ask a question in Spanish, we have the capacity to translate. And likewise, if somebody on the web wants to send in a question in Spanish, we have the capacity for that as well. So first, I would just ask my colleagues on the dais if there are any particular questions for Brian. Okay, so I have a question. It's something I've always wondered about, and I know we have some technical people on the audience. Maybe they can help. You mentioned at the very beginning that there are 3 waste streams that come out that are out of, as a result of the recycling process. Sulfuric acid, plastic, and lead. Did I get that right? Okay. And yet one of the things that we're very worried about and that the risk assessment showed was a problem was arsenic. So where does the arsenic come from?
Rizgar? I'm going to invite Rizgar, our branch chief for the Office of Permitting, to respond to that question.
Thanks.
The arsenic is additive to the battery smelting operations, depending on the customer's needs. For example, we know that your battery terminals need to be hard, so that arsenic is a hardener to the lead. So it's an additive they add to the lead.
So the Exide adds the arsenic in, or it's a mixture in the battery? It's already in the battery terminal, so when it melts, it comes off?
It's both. So the batteries that we have already that's being recycled already has some arsenic in it. However, depending on the customer's needs, depending what type of lead product they'd want, they add additional arsenic to the product to get the specific specifications they need.
Thank you. I always wondered that. Okay, so thank you, Brian. That was very helpful to see the kind of commitment that we have to work with the facility and to hold the facility accountable and work with the community to let them know what's going on to the best of our ability. So my last question is in terms of timing. You said that this Friday we get a plan, and that plan will be how pregnant women and children will be protected in the short run and how future testing is done. Is that what's in the plan?
The plan that we asked for, we directed Exide to submit, does several things. The first is we directed them to propose the interim measures, those first steps that they can take to make sure that there are not potential risks posed to the most vulnerable residents. So what are they going to do in those homes where there are pregnant women and children?
Okay.
So it may be the initial step, recognizing that there are bare soil areas, for instance, or places where kids could become exposed, possibly putting down a layer of gravel or mulch or sod to make sure that there's not direct contact, those kinds of activities. That's the first step. Also, looking out further into the neighborhood where there are levels that are higher. We found levels. I think there were 3 levels over 400 parts per million and about 8 locations where there were levels above 300 parts per million. Additionally, we told Exide, you need to look at all of those areas and tell us what you're going to do to make sure that there are no exposure pathways in the short term. At the same time, in this same plan due on Friday, additional sampling proposal to do more detailed sampling in those neighborhoods where we have the general information, but that we need more refined, detailed house-by-house information to make sure that we're making the right decisions to determine what the next steps will be. In that plan also on Friday is the proposal to step out in those neighborhoods, out and around these areas that we've already sampled. Also, we have asked them in that plan to do additional testing around the one school that had the slightly elevated level to the north of the facility. And what I understand, reported last week, I know that LA County Health did some additional testing in the area around this park, around the school. The school actually is in a park. It's a building in Salazar Park. The county did some additional testing out in that park and has declared that they do not see any significant risk associated with the concentrations that they saw from those additional samples that they did.
Okay, so and then it's my understanding that because this is got a public process associated with it. This plan that lays out all of that, I'm assuming it's going to be fairly technical. It's not going to be written for the general public, and yet you want the community to see it and respond to it. So will you be talking about this at the public meeting and letting people know and helping them review and comment?
I would anticipate the public meetings that we're having this week, we're having before we get that plan. I think the approach you just mentioned would be a great approach for the meeting that we intend to have in Maywood, and as well on our website have that kind of explanation, a real English and a real Spanish explanation of what has been proposed by Exide, as well as what DTSC's response to their proposal is. So in that spirit of transparency, making sure that the communities know which way we're headed with this.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so with that, are there any comment cards or any questions? No, not from no one in the room. Okay, and what about from the web? All right, so with that, I'm going to assume that no one who is listening or watching has a particular question for Brian. Thank you so much, Brian. And if you do, if you think, oh my goodness, I wish I'd asked, you know where to find us. So please send an email to Brian or to our department and let us know, and we would be happy to answer any questions that you have. Thanks, Brian.
Thank you very much. I also just want to thank once again all of the staff who have been putting in an extraordinary effort to move this project along and have adopted the spirit and the intent of protecting this community. I want to thank you all very much.
We are going to move to our second presentation, which is a very different kind of announcement. And this has to do with the release of the names of our priority products that happened last Thursday. And so I am going to ask Meredith Williams, the Deputy Director for our Safer Products in Workplaces program, to introduce the concept and her staff. Thanks, Meredith.
Good morning. As many of you may have heard the last time we had a public meeting, the regulations for safer consumer products went into effect in October of last year. Since that time, staff have been very busy working with stakeholders and experts in other agencies of in the state to identify potential products that could be prioritized for our first listing. So as of last Thursday, we announced 3 different products that we are concerned about and we are proposing to go to regulation on and begin the rulemaking process because of the particular hazards associated with very specific chemicals in those products. And so this morning, we will hear from 2 of our staff members, our experts on those topics. I do want to say a little bit about what it's been like since the announcement. We are very encouraged. We're encouraged. There are a couple myths that I would like to dispel, take a moment to dispel. But in general, we're happy that people do understand that this is a process. Gene Ulrich said when the regulations were adopted in last October, he said, green chemistry is a process. It's not an endpoint in and of itself. And I think that's it's a very hard message for folks to truly appreciate, that this is the beginning of a rather lengthy process, which to some people is frustrating. Why aren't you just banning the chemicals in the products? And in fact, we are not banning the chemicals and products. We have a very science-based deliberative process, and we're going to go through that process and respect it in order to make sure that we've made the right decisions about the products that we've selected, and make sure that we hear from our stakeholders, make sure that we understand what the implications are for us taking regulatory action on these particular products. So the biggest myth that I wanted to dispel is it's not a ban. It is not a ban. It's not a ban. And I think we can't say that enough. It is a complicated process. It is a lengthy process, but we're going to get there, and we're going to get there in a way that allows us to be confident in our decisions and assured of the actions that we take. So with that, I will introduce two of our staff members. Carl Palmer is our branch chief for this Safer Consumer Products branch. And Andre Elghazi is a senior scientist also in that branch, and they have provided extraordinary leadership in getting us to this point, crafting the regulations, leading the team that really put together all of the background information that was required to get us to this point, and we are very happy to be at this point. So with that, Carl.
Thank you, Dr. Williams and Director Rafael and executive staff. It's a pleasure to be here today, and we're going to do a couple of things. We're going to give an update as to where we are in implementation since I last reported to you at the last public meeting, and then we're really going to focus in on our announcement last week of our priority products and go through each one of those and describe what they are, a little bit about the rationale for how we made that decision, and then we're going to talk about where we go from here in process. And then we'll be able to answer any questions you have. So with that, there are a couple of things I want to highlight, but before we get there, I want to do a quick refresher just to give the context of what the regulations are, what the key components of implementation are that align with that. So if you recall, last September, we announced at the end of that month our list of candidate chemicals. There were approximately 1,100 chemicals that we put in an informational list, which pointed to the 20-plus list that we adopted in regulation that we brought in from authoritative bodies throughout the world that identified specific chemicals that had specific hazard traits. It might have caused cancer, it might be a reproductive toxin, a neurotoxin, etc. And that's the menu, if you will, of the chemicals that we're concerned about in consumer products. So that's our template from which we're choosing our priority products and the chemicals that we want to focus on. So that was last September. Now, last week, we came out with our initial proposed list of priority products, which are, in this case, 3 consumer products that contain one or more of those chemicals that are on those lists. And I'm going to talk a little bit later about the rationale for that. But that's the point we're in today. And we're going to go through a process of formally adopting those priority products in regulation. And then that will set the next phase in motion, which is the third step in here, which is what we call alternatives analysis. That process is a very specific, scientific-based process that we're going to require the manufacturers of these priority products to look at their product and ask one big basic question. Is it necessary that you use this chemical that we've identified has certain hazard traits in your product? Can you use a safer chemical? Can you eliminate the use of that chemical at all? Or, and Dr. Williams talked about bans, this isn't the process of just looking at what's not going to be in that product, but what you're going to put in it in its place. Because one of the key concepts in our regulatory framework is to try to ensure that we don't just ban something and push away from something only to move to another chemical that might pose similar, or in some cases worse, hazards to people in the environment down the road. That process is going to be a long process, and it's a detailed process. I'm going to talk briefly about that. We're not going to focus today on the alternatives analysis process, maybe at a future meeting. So once we get through that process, which will be a long, deliberative process, at that point, the manufacturers will come back to the department with their analysis and say, here's our proposal for how we're going to make our product safer. And at that point, we will look at that analysis and say, you know, what did you do and what's your proposal? And if necessary, if we feel that we need to take a regulatory action to ensure that people or the environment are protected, then we have a menu of options to impose what we call regulatory responses that range in a breadth of everything from requiring additional information be provided to us or information being provided to consumers so that they know the potential risks of using that product. We can require that they do additional research if there's a data gap that we need to fill so we can be confident that this is a good design or an approach. And ultimately, we can actually restrict the sale or ban the sale of that consumer product if it isn't protective of people and the environment. So that's the snapshot, the overall process that aligns with our regulations and where we're headed. I want to take a quick diversion before we get to priority products. I want to highlight a couple things that have happened since we last met. One is at the end of January, we convened our reconstituted Green Ribbon Science Panel, which is a robust body of 15 folks from across the country representing industry, academia, health and environmental organizations. And this is an amazing group of individuals with vast amount of experience and knowledge and capability that we're looking to, in the short run, to help us help the people who are going to be doing these alternatives analyses. We're in the process of developing guidance that will be provided to all the stakeholders to say this is the requirements in our regulations on how you do and alternatives analysis and the methodologies and the tools and examples, and the Green Urban Science Panel is going to assist us in looking first in our next meeting, which is coming up in April. We have a 2-day meeting in the 9th and 10th of April. We're going to be looking at starting from the framework of what is out there internationally in terms of how people do alternatives analysis, or as many people call it, alternatives assessment. California's system is unique and very special. It's broader and deeper than most other existing frameworks out there. So we're going to be looking at what other folks are doing, trying to learn from them, take those approaches that make sense in the California system, and then find where those gaps are, where we need good science, good information, good technical people to help us formulate this guidance so people can get through the alternatives analysis process. So that's where we're headed with the Green Ribbon Science Panel. The other thing I wanted to highlight is that we are concurrently working to update our data and information management system to take us to the next level so that we can utilize the web as a portal for information sharing. Not just that we're going to be posting information, but we're going to be collecting a lot of information as we go through this process. Both, as you'll see in a minute, as we talk about the selection of our priority products, but also as we go through the alternatives analysis process. So we want to have a good tool that can collect information and that people can find that information in our system. An important part of that is the ability to collect and protect information which is subject to trade secret and confidential business information requirements in our regulations and in California. It's very important that we ensure the confidentiality of that information. And so we're working with US EPA and others who have systems in place to do this, and we're going to build that so that the stakeholders can be confident that when they give us that information, that it'll be protected. But the bigger issue in some sense is that what we're trying to do is ensure that all the stakeholders out there have an opportunity to get and receive information from us, as well as submit information to us and search that. Part of the fundamental strength of this process is sharing information, transparency, and letting the community who purchase these products, the people that manufacture and sell these products, know what's out there in the world, the good science, the guidance, the alternatives assessments that others might do that they can look at and say, that's a great idea, I can use that information, and let the market use that as well as us. So that's an important part of where we are. Now I'm going to shift gears a little and get to where people are very interested in the follow-up of last week's announcement on our priority products. And I'm happy to introduce Andre Algazi. He's our senior environmental scientist who's led the team of scientists, engineers, toxicologists, lawyers, biologists, et cetera, here at the department who've worked very diligently to get us to where we are today, and they're very committed to get us to the next part as well. So I'm going to let Andre go through the priority products with you right
now. Thank you, Carl, and good morning, Director Rafael and members of the executive staff. I'm going to give a little overview of our 3 product chemical combinations that we have identified as potential priority products with chemicals of concern. So I'll be talking about the product itself, the chemical, the hazard traits, the potential exposures, and what we know about alternatives. And then I'm going to hand it back to Carl to talk about a bit about the criteria and that we use to sort of arrive at this initial proposed priority products list. So the first product that we've put on our proposed list is children's foam padded sleeping products containing a flame retardant called TDCPP. You can see a list of products here that includes a variety of foam padded products that are used specifically for children sleeping. So they include pads that they sleep on, positioners, foam used in playpens, things like that. I won't read the whole list. The commonality is that they're all made of polyurethane foam, and the products we're specifically trying to capture are treated with this flame retardant, TDCPP. And the picture kind of illustrates some of the products we're talking about. Mostly there are a number of nap mats there which have a vinyl coating over the TDCPP containing foam, and as well I think there's a bassinet pad there in that picture. So why did we select this product specifically, or what is it about this chemical? TDCPP is a known carcinogen. It's been identified as such by OEHA on the Prop 65 list. It's also an endocrine disruptor. It can interfere with the endocrine system in a number of ways. And specific concern about exposure here is for children and infants. Children and infants have been found to ingest approximately 5 times as much house dust as adults in a total mass per day, and the TDCPP adheres to dust particles, so ingestion of dust as well as inhalation and dermal exposure are all routes of exposures that can expose children to this chemical. The particular products that we've named here, the foam padded sleeping products, were selected not to include things that are subject to a requirement for flame retardancy, like mattresses under the federal standards for flame retardancy, and upholstered furniture under the state Bear Hefty Technical Bulletin 117/2013 standards. So these are things that aren't subject to flame retardancy requirements. The chemicals aren't necessary. They are very debatable what benefit they have as far as protection of the children, and clearly there's an exposure potential. So that's sort of how we arrived at this category. So moving on to the second of our 3 priority products, we have spray polyurethane foam systems containing unreacted diisocyanates. And this product, actually there are several sort of variations, permutations of this product. They're composed of 2 mixtures of chemicals that they refer to as side A and B, and side A is mostly diisocyanates, which is the chemical we're talking about, and I'll tell you a bit about that in a moment. So essentially, when these 2 chemicals are mixed, or these 2 solutions are mixed together, there are a series of chemical reactions that causes them to expand and then become a rigid foam, which has some useful properties. It's used to insulate buildings and houses. It's useful for weatherizing and sealing as well, and it's used in roofing. So the chemicals that we're talking about, diisocyanates, there actually are several, and several of them we call out in our product profile, which we've prepared for this product, which are toluene diisocyanate, methylene diisocyanate, and hexamethylene diisocyanate. All 3 of these chemicals are related, and they have similar hazard traits. Exposure to diisocyanates is the leading cause of occupational asthma, according to OSHA. It is a respiratory sensitizer, and what that means is that people who are exposed to this one of these chemicals, if they're re-exposed, can have a much more serious reaction. They can have an acute asthma attack that can cause death, and there are incidences of worker deaths from exposure and repeated exposure to these chemicals. The specific populations who can be exposed to diisocyanates from these products include workers who are potentially working for contractors, insulating and sealing buildings, as well as people who purchase the single can sort of diisocyanate products that can be bought at home improvement and hardware stores. They've got the 2 sides I mentioned already mixed up in the can, and when they spray them, then they are exposed to the vapors of diisocyanates, and so are the other members of the household, bystanders, things like that. It's important to point out that it's the wet, uncured product that poses the exposure risk. According to some of the manufacturer information that is provided with the products, some of these things take up to 72 hours to cure, and and until that happens, there's a potential for exposure to the chemicals, and very obviously serious consequences can result. With regard to alternatives to diisocyanates for these products, currently, if you want an expanding foam, there really aren't commercially available expanding foam products that don't contain diisocyanates. There are things in development, but the commercial products that are available currently that we're aware of all contain up to 50% diisocyanates. For certain types of applications, functional applications that you might use foam and you could use some other type of product, for example, in building insulation, there are a number of other insulating materials that have insulating properties that aren't foams and don't contain the chemicals, and we've listed a couple, cellulose and fiberglass insulation. And so that will bring us to our third product category on our initial proposed priority products list, which is paint and varnish strippers containing methylene chloride. These products are used to, as the name implies, to remove paint and varnish from surfaces. Methylene chloride is a strong solvent. It's a chlorinated solvent that is good at removing paint from surfaces. And as of one study that we found, which was several years old, most of the paint and varnish strippers on the market in California were of the methylene chloride type. So why are we picking out this product specifically? What is it about methylene chloride? Methylene chloride is another carcinogenic chemical. It is a neurotoxin, and in acute exposure in the body, it's metabolized to produce carbon monoxide and causes carbon monoxide poisoning in people exposed to it. Again, it's a worker exposure issue as well as an exposure potential for DIY, people doing home paint stripping projects. There was a study I think maybe 20 years ago or so, in which they simulated a home paint stripping without ventilation, and the level of methylene chloride in the air was 2,000 parts per million, which is approaching the immediately dangerous to life and health level. So it's in a poorly ventilated area, exposure can be very high to the level where it can cause fatality. There have been quite a few fatalities documented over the last 12, 14 years. And most recent data I saw was at 12 or 14 fatalities, occupational exposed people, specifically people stripping bathtubs. So again, this is an inhalation exposure, and especially without adequate ventilation, there's a high risk of exposure, or there is exposure. There are a number of other chemical paint stripping products available on the market. We've named a couple of them here. There are also other ways to remove paint besides using solvents. There are alkaline strippers, there's sanding, there are physical methods. So there are other products on the market that can be used for the functional requirement of getting paint and varnish off surfaces. So those are the three product chemical combinations that we've proposed for the initial proposed priority products list. Carl is going to come back up now and talk to you a little bit about the process and the criteria that we use to select these three products.
Thank you, Andre. So there are the three priority products again, and we'll go to the next slide. I just want to outline that in our regulations, there are criteria for how we guided us in our selection. The two big broad criteria are that you have to have potential exposure to this chemical from the product that we select, and that exposure has to have potential to cause significant harm or an adverse impact to people or the environment. And as Andre outlined, you heard some of those pathways, exposures, and potential outcomes, which are fairly straightforward in the case of these three. We're very confident about the hazard traits of these chemicals. These chemicals that we've selected are not in dispute in terms of the potential risks that they pose. The science is sound. We have lots of information on that. Additionally, we looked at on the exposure side. Our regulations highlight a few things that can give us a little bit more of a priority in our selection. One important one being the impact on sensitive subpopulations. And in this case, we're particularly looking at children and workers and people who are around those workers who are impacted. And that's important because workers are a sensitive subpopulation because of the duration of exposure to the product and chemical combination. And then obviously children are a very sensitive subpopulation we're concerned about. There are other factors that we considered. Andre highlighted that one of them was, are there alternatives? We considered the availability of alternatives, and I think you see an interesting mix in these three products of balancing one priority product proposal, the NAP mats, where we believe that the alternative is pretty clear. You don't need to put that chemical in that product. Another one, methylene chloride and paint strippers, there are on the market today alternatives that work. The third one, the spray polyurethane foam, is a little more challenging on the technical side because the foam chemistries, there are not very viable alternatives right now, but there are other functional alternatives. So this is a good mix, I think, to look at as we go through the process. And it's also important to know that we also consider the entire life cycle of the use of these products. So while we're focusing primarily on workers and children, there are exposures throughout the life cycle of these products that are important. And let me just talk a little about the next steps. So it's important, as Dr. Williams pointed out, that we, as of last Thursday when we made this announcement, we didn't ban anything. There was no regulatory effect on last Thursday. What we're starting is a deliberate process to adopt these priority products in regulation. And one of the things that's important to us is that we have a very transparent and open process of sharing information so that we can make sure that we've made good decisions. What we've posted on our webpage are a few documents that I would encourage people to look at. One are the fact sheets related to these documents, but probably more specifically and importantly, we've put forth product profiles for each of these priority product candidates that outline, aligned with our regulations, the literature search that we've done, the data that we've used to make these decisions, the exposure documentation, et cetera, that lay out our rationale. Coming up in May and June, we're going to hold public workshops that we are encouraging people to come and give us input. If there is additional data that we didn't consider, that we didn't have, or if someone wants to look at evaluating some of that data, they're welcome to give us input on that because we want to get it right. As we go through that workshop process, we'll be collecting information to compile all the documents we need to begin the formal rulemaking process, because each one of these priority products needs to be adopted in regulation through the formal Administrative Procedure Act process. And one thing that means in terms of process is in going through that rulemaking, everyone will have a very discrete and specific opportunity to give us formal comment that we will evaluate and respond to. Additionally, we'll have a public hearing at the end of that process. So there's going to be, between the workshops, between the rulemaking, a lot of opportunity for dialogue on these products and the data that supports their selection. Once they're finally adopted in regulation, that is an important point, because at that point, when we notice the final list, that's when the regulatory clock starts ticking for those responsible entities, manufacturers, who are required to do an alternatives analysis. And that's where, if you look on this chart down to the bottom there, the clock starts for notifying the department that you're a manufacturer that makes one of these products and that you're going to then start conducting an alternatives analysis process. And so it's important in the context of timing that this is going to be a deliberate process. It's information driven. We're going to be working with industry, retailers, health and environmental organizations to get additional good information moving forward, and we're looking forward to that process. So when are those workshops? The first workshop is going to be held here in Sacramento on May 7th, followed by a workshop in Oakland on the 28th of May, and we're in the process of trying to lock in a date in the Los Angeles area for a workshop as well. Another thing I wanted to highlight is that concurrently, we're starting the process of looking at a priority products work plan. Our regulations stipulate that by October of this coming year, we put in place a 3-year work plan which identifies categories of potential priority products that will be considered by DTSC for the next round of selection. So this is going to be an important process. We anticipate a lot of folks are going to say, well, why didn't you pick this or why didn't you pick that? Here's some good candidates. We'll be putting those in the parking lot and evaluating all those recommendations. We may get petitioned. There are petition processes available to stakeholders in the regulations, so we're going to get additional information about potential priority products that we'll consider. And as we workshop that process, what will come out of it in this work plan is a couple of things. One is a message to the market saying, these are the things that are next in the queue. And one of the things I want to highlight is that outside of the regulatory requirements, there's nothing that prevents the manufacturers of these products right now to start working on their products and making them safer. We are already seeing the markets move on many fronts, looking at our candidate chemical lists, saying if I have one of these chemicals in my product, perhaps I should be looking at alternatives right now. And so we encourage that as well. But the 3-year work plan will specifically say this is what's next in the queue, and you can start working towards that. Additionally, because we are going to go through the rulemaking process, there's going to be a lot of dialogue around what's coming and does it make sense. I also want to highlight that there's a lot of information available on our webpage. There's the link. As I mentioned, we have fact sheets. We have frequently asked questions that we'll be adding to as we get more questions and we need to clarify things for folks. And then the priority product profiles, which are great documents to get a lot of information about our priority product selection. Also, we don't have a specific format or process for our workshops up on the web yet, but we will, and I encourage you to look at that. And I wanted to briefly highlight that we have in our Toxics Information Clearinghouse on our webpage an awful lot of information about chemicals, exposure, etc. It's a portal to other search engines and web pages that are very data rich. So if you have a specific question about your product or chemical, you can look there. And then we're also happy to answer questions, and the email address for our questions is there at saferconsumerproducts@dtsc.ca.gov. And if you haven't, please sign up for our listserv, which you can also do on the web page. So with that, this concludes our presentation, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Carl, and thank you, Andre, for that, and thank you, Meredith. So first off, any questions from my colleagues up on the dais? Okay, just me again. So I have a question. So you talk about the 3-year work plan coming up, and when I think about the first set of priority products, the selection really wasn't done in a very public manner. It was, we got together, we looked at the criteria and came out, and so it was a huge surprise to people because they didn't know. Whereas the next round, I'm just curious, as you think about developing that work plan, I have a couple questions that come up. Number one, what will the role of the public, industry, GRASP, the Green Ribbon Science Panel be on that? And then secondly, 3 years is a long time. So is it fixed in stone? I mean, are we going to project 3 years, this is it? Or do we revisit that on an annual basis? How does that work?
Sure. Well, I think that the work plan is important, as you allude to, is to get stakeholder engagement and involvement. Information is the coin of the realm for us, and so data is important. So whether you're a health or environmental organization or an industry, we want to know what you think is good for us to focus on. The criteria are laid out in the regulations. There's a lot of landscape out there for picking, and we have a wide range of discretion. So with the limited prioritization in the regulations, we want the community of practice, everyone, to have a dialogue that says, here's some key things that make sense based on our criteria. And if we share the data and information, I think those will prioritize and rise to the top. We'll still have potentially a lot of candidates. But we're very strong in evaluating hazard criteria, chemistry, fate and transport, all that stuff. What we have limited ability to get is market information. We don't have, as a department, as much experience in manufacturing and the supply chains and channels, which are important throughout this process. So it's going to be a great opportunity for everyone from retailers, consumers, and the manufacturers to inform us about how the system works and what makes sense next in the queue. And to the second part of your question, it is a revolving, continuous process. We will, before the end of the second year of the 3-year work plan, update it again. So we see this as a continuous process. And one important thing is we're starting very discreetly and slowly with only 3 products. The first round of chemicals for consideration were somewhat limited as well because we, as you know, put on ourselves the constriction to say the first set of chemicals will only come from lists where they're on an exposure list and on a hazard trait list. So there's a smaller subset of chemicals. For subsequent rounds, it's wide open to all 1,100 chemicals, and there's no restriction on the number of priority products. We'll also be learning as we go how this works about our strength and bandwidth to get through the process, and that will be informative, I think, as well. That can give us some insight as to how many next in the queue we can address.
I also want to go back to this question of transparency. It was not an open process. We got a lot of input from a lot of places, but we didn't necessarily invite people into the conversation. And some industries are definitely feeling blindsided. You have said repeatedly that one of the criteria for success for this program is whether or not we've sent a signal to the market, whether or not the market knows what our thinking is and then begins to respond by evaluating alternatives and being ahead of us almost in terms of how we work. And they can't do that if they're not seeing what our thought processes are, how we're making decisions, and what our priorities are. So I do think we need to find appropriate ways to make sure we have adequate transparency to be successful on that front.
And I might add that there's opportunity for innovation here on some of those more challenging ones down the road if there's a good dialogue. We've met with a lot of companies that are interested in is there a niche for them to put resources towards new chemistries, new products, new things that are good for everyone, but maybe the market isn't there yet. But if we send signals that we're going to go this direction and we need an alternative for this type of thing, that's going to stimulate innovation.
That's a great point. Yeah, thank you. Brian?
I don't know if this is covered in your 3-year work plan, but at what point do you anticipate that these first 3 product chemical combinations will be far enough down the process where you can begin contemplating what that next group will be?
Well, the work plan will lay that out for us, and there's some set timeframes and when we'll start considering next products. From a practical standpoint, I think as we go through the rulemaking for the priority products and develop the AA guidance, we'll see how ambitious we can be, and I think we'll get a lot of input from folks. So some of that remains to be seen. This is a new program. We're developing new processes. We're working with some new stakeholders, but we're committed to moving forward and staying the course.
So Carl and Andre, I have one more question. I think it's an interesting dilemma. You brought up the fact that this first set of products came from a subset of the chemicals. So it was 153 menu as opposed to 1,100. And yet my understanding, one of the alternatives for methylene chloride is actually on the larger list, but isn't on the smaller list. So are we vulnerable? Are we of a regrettable substitute at this point?
Good question. Yes, one of the alternatives currently in use in the paint stripping world is NMP. And we would consider that a regrettable substitute because it has some hazard characteristics that are very similar to, and of magnitude similar to methylene chloride. And we can't get to that in this first round in terms of focus and authority. we can in the next round. I would anticipate we're going to have that discussion in the work plan, which would be, it makes sense to say, moving forward on paint strippers, should we include NMP and paint strippers in the next round? And and concurrently, the three we picked, we've evaluated a whole bunch of other potential priority products. So we have sort of in the hopper, if you will, a lot of information that we'll consider. But I think that it's important that with the list of chemicals out there and the process, then, for example, in this case, the people that manufacture paint strippers can look forward and say, why would I wait for DTSC to put NMP in there when there are already good alternatives? Let's design that away. Let's move forward faster. Because the market is going to be, if they want to be, faster than we can in terms of adopting regulations.
Thank you. Stuart.
Real quick, Carl, the clock's ticking on the 60-day time frame for notification, correct?
No, it's not.
It's not.
No, actually, I'm glad you brought that up because there's been some misinformation out in some of the media is that
That's what I
that
wanted.
clock doesn't. Go back to the slide. Sure, I think so. Yes. So where we are right now is at the top of this chart on March 13th. There's no regulatory effect of that on any of the manufacturers of those priority products. We're going to hold the workshops. We're going to go through formal rulemaking, which once we initiate, that could take up to a year. And once those rules are adopted, that's when the clock starts for saying, these are the priority products. Now you have 60 days to notify us, and then you can start the first phase of the alternatives analysis process.
Thank you. That was exactly my question. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Carl. Thank you, Andre and Meredith and everyone for your questions. So are there comment cards? Those look like they're electronic. Okay. And there's some in the room. Okay. We'll have a minute for folks to get the comment cards, and I'll just call you up. Okay, so we're going to start with folks in the room, and if you could come up to the microphone, is that right? Yeah, come up to the over there, the dais. So Greg Gorder from Technology Sciences Group. Sorry, Greg, come on up.
Yeah, so I wanted to ask, I'm sure you're familiar with EPA's action plan on elimination of diisocyanates from consumer products and addressing the same occupational exposures that you're intending here. And I'm just wondering if you could comment if there's overlapping authority or if there's coordination or, how you see that working out.
Okay, so the issue, thanks, Greg. So the issue is one of if another agency, in this case EPA, is already taking a look at either the product or the chemicals, in this case diisocyanates or methylene chloride or flame retardants, is there some sort of overlap with what we're doing and them? Certainly we are aware of what EPA is doing. Carl, do you want to take that?
Yes, thanks for the question. Actually, we view this as a good thing that EPA is working on many of these chemicals, whether it's developing a work plan or doing a risk assessment. They're very parallel to the interests of everyone, I think, because the core of this is good science and looking at alternatives. We work closely with EPA. We have a memorandum of understanding with US EPA to ensure that we share data and information and cooperate so that we don't go cross-current. And in the long run, I think all that information is going to be very helpful as we go through the process. But there's not a regulatory conflict there at this point in any sense.
Other comments on overlapping authorities?
In general, at the national level, we do want to stay aligned with what's happening at the national level. We're very mindful of the fact that TSCA is being looked at for possible reform. California decided not to wait. We don't know what the outcome of any of that's going to be. We are in good communication. We're very well aligned, and we can be actionable now, and we chose to be actionable.
Andre.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention that in researching this product and the other ones, we did, pursuant to the criteria in our own regulations, look carefully at other regulatory programs for the same product, for the same chemical exposure. So we have been talking with EPA under our MOU, so we're...
Actually, yeah. Can you expand on that a little bit? Was EPA aware of what we were doing? Were they concerned about what we were doing? Because do they feel like it's a
aware
problem?
and supportive, I would say. So
Okay. Because this MOU is what?
just that we make sure that we're sharing information both ways as far as what we're working on.
And it's a memorandum of understanding that was signed by both US EPA and DTSC.
Right.
Right. All right. Thank you.
Since, if I could, and that doesn't just apply to EPA. I know that some of the chemicals that we named have some regulatory limits posed by CalOSHA. And but those limits do not apply to do-it-yourselfers. They don't apply to people who are independent contractors and don't fall under the OSHA guidance. And so we did look carefully at that, and we're confident that we're not redundant with any other regulatory actions.
Great point. Okay, so this came in via email, and it's a great question. It's really logical. Tom Lewandowski, and it's regarding TDCPP in children's polyurethane foam sleeping products. If the products are covered, as shown, with PVC coverings, how is the dust exposure pathway viable? Although hazard rather than risk drives the AA process, my understanding was that the identification of the priority products does include potential for exposure. And this is something, I'll just answer a little bit of this and then let you guys answer. It's such a legit question. You think about the foam you're sitting on, it's got fabric on it. You think foam is very rarely exposed in people's homes, and yet what you see in data is that the dust in people's homes is loaded with flame retardants. And so where is that dust is not coming from the foam itself. It's an off-gassing of the chemical that then adheres to foam. So the one would think, well, isn't the foam's not degrading because you have something outside of it, but it's not dust from the foam itself. So Carl, Andre, you want to expound?
Yes, what you said as well. It does off gas, and it does there is data that we found in researching this product, a number of studies. Specifically, there was one in daycare centers in which they found 3 to 4 times higher levels of TDCPP in dust in daycare centers where they used these mats. So the TDCPP is escaping, notwithstanding the vinyl covering.
Wow, thank you. Disturbing. Thank you. That was a great question. The next question from Paul DeLeo, and Paul from the American Cleaning Institute. He has worked a good deal with us on this process, and I will read his questions. His question: can you specify the standard for identifying the products? We understand that DTSC would be using the BRIC level from the Global Product Classification from the GS1 as the basis for identifying products in a way that manufacturers, retailers, and other regulated entities will understand. This was the case for spray polyurethane foam and the paint strippers. However, the children's foam padded sleeping product does not follow this approach. It appears to be a class of products and is not apparent that the list of individual products included is exhaustive. For examples, are mattresses included? It seems these would be foam padded sleeping products, but they're not called out. So what Paul's question is getting at is the complexity of how do you define a product, and do you use an industry standard or one? Is there some other? And is this a question that you can answer quickly, or should we get back to Paul? You can answer it in general. Okay, Andre.
Thank you. So we obviously are a big consideration, and our goal is to define the product category very clearly, unambiguously, in a way that the manufacturers and retailers and affected responsible parties know what we're talking about. And he's correct that in the case of the padded sleeping products, we weren't able to find a neat sort of corresponding GPC taxonomy that would exactly capture the product that we want, that we're talking about. So the proposal of this list, and the workshops we're having, we really do hope that we will get some feedback so that if people are unclear about certain things being in or out, if there are other references we can use, other terminology, we want to hone and refine the definition to make sure that it's clear. And with regard to mattresses, we defined this category to exclude mattresses deliberately. Mattresses are subject to flame retardancy standards that these pads are not. So while they're not, the mattress flame retardancy standards under the CPSC regulations don't prescribe the use of this particular chemical, we were trying to define a category that was not captured in the upholstered furniture category nor under the mattress category. And so we couldn't find, in the GPC, the GS1 classification scheme, bricks and attribute codes that exactly described our product categories. So we need to use words, and we hope we've used the right words, and we welcome comments and suggestions.
Excellent. Thank you, Andre. Thanks, Paul, for that question. And I think it points to the challenge that we have sometimes at using plain English versus what the kinds of language that industry understands and thinks about their own manufacturing. Okay, well, because I don't have any more questions from the audience, I'm going to wrap it up. So I would just like to say that to me, today's public meeting represents sort of the perfect bookends, if you will, of this department, where you have a sin of the past, this idea of a facility operating in a low-income community, impacting the residents, polluting with lead, potentially polluting with arsenic as well, and an agency like DTSC who's charged with the very complex responsibility of helping them either to get their act in order and comply or stop doing business in California. And you have that then bookended with the Safer Consumer Product work, which is in a sense asking of industry a similar thing. Make your products safe or don't sell anymore in California. And yet it's much more forward-looking, and it's much more nuanced on looking at safer alternatives and reducing regrettable substitutes. So these are areas, this is the kinds of breadth that our staff deal with in our department. It's a very exciting time for this department. We are fixing our foundation. We are enforcing the law. We are cleaning up sites. We are creating robust and defensible permits. We are challenging manufacturers to look at their product formulations. We are engaging with communities, and we're doing all of that, as Brian Johnson said, with our first and foremost commitment of protecting the public's health and that of the environment as well. So with that, I want to thank you for joining us today. These meetings are very important for us. I want to thank all the staff people that worked on those presentations. And our next meeting is June 11th, so mark your calendars if you like. I don't know yet what the agenda will be. It could be breaking news that's happening in June or happened in May. It could be something else. So the agenda will be posted on our website. You can get notified via email lists. You can sign up in the back of the room if you want to be notified by email. So with that, I thank you and I wish you a good rest of your day.